This is the Compass Podcast, where we give you a glimpse of the divine in the everyday. I am Ryan Dunn, and in this episode of our podcast, Pierce Drake and I are joined by Rozella Haydee White. I know a lot of us are longing to change the world, and Rosella joined us to talk about the ways that we can go about doing that, particularly through the ways that we navigate our interpersonal relationships. And while we think in a macro level while looking to change the world, Rosella calls our attention to the micro, specifically how we engage in friendly relationships with the people around us, and really how we engage in the relationship we have with ourselves. There's a lot of great advice that comes through the interview that we have with Rosella. She is a public theologian, she's a spiritual life coach, a leadership consultant, an inspirational speaker. You're going to get a lot of inspiration through this time. A writer focused on nurturing life-giving love in the world. She engages in issues of faith, of justice, self-awareness and love, mental illness, and the radical, transformative love of God as embodied in the person of Jesus. She's also written a book called Love Big, The Power of Revolutionary Relationships to Heal the World. We had a lot of fun in this interview. We also were challenged and left with a feeling of warmth and hope. And I hope that comes through to you as well. So our conversation with Rosella is coming up. Rozella Haydee White is with us. Rosella, how you doing today?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
Doing just fine, I think.
There you go.
Pierce, you got a stunning answer on that one, or
I don't.
Okay.
I'm doing great. I'm sleeping, and to have an 8-week-old, that everybody tells me that's awesome. So
that is incredible.
I'm taking it, man. I am taking it and running with it.
It's funny. A lot of times we open up this podcast and asking each other, how goes it with your soul? You pull that out in your book, but you pull it out towards the end. And so we really want to get into that subject when we get to the end of the interview. Normally, that's about as deep theologically as we get on something like this. We're our lane is not to go super deep theologically. But you start your book, which is called Love Big. It's the power of revolutionary relationships to heal the world. You start off by going really kind of theologically deep. You dive into the idea of the Trinity. And usually that's a topic that I would not touch because it seemed like every time I try to describe the Trinity, I'm committing heresy of some kind. I don't know if you've gone through this, but
I just go back to my mom always comparing it to some kind of fruit.
Yeah, it's all wrong.
I don't think that's right, Mom. I get it, but
yeah,
I don't
it makes sense, but somebody's going to label that as some kind of...
Or we would always hear it as water. So water, ice.
Oh, yeah.
Steam. Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's partialism or something like that.
That's
it's
right.
Not...
Can't be all three at once.
That's right.
Can't be steam and ice.
Well, you don't try to explain the Trinity for us, thankfully. You leave it at this holy mystery that it is. But it is very important to you, the idea of Trinity.
Yes.
Why is Trinity so important to you?
So I'm glad that you all noticed I was not interested in proving anything about the Trinity. I'm not an apologist. I am a practical theologian. And it's interesting even that you said that you all don't dive into theology, but the question of how is it with your soul is a deeply or profoundly theological and spiritual question.
Yeah. Well, in some way, everything is theology, right? It's just not a named thing that we're going after.
Right. And practical theology, I feel is the way that I engage theological study because it starts with the lived experience. It starts with who people are. It starts with the experience of their life, all of the ups, the downs, all of it. And I start there before I start with the folks that have pontificated about something or before I start with all of the interpretations of a thing. I just want to hear about people's lives. And so for me, starting with the Trinity made sense because I'm someone who's interested in relationships. And I believe inherently that God is a relational God. And that is what the most clearly seen in what we understand to be the Trinity. And so we talk about people of Christian Trinitarian faith talk about the Trinity as this idea of God in three persons. And I say that I don't really care to prove it. I'm not someone who proves things. I am someone who is fine with the mystery. I'm someone who's fine with that which seems like fantastical and you wonder about it, but it keeps calling you back. And so I was just curious about what the Trinity can teach us or show us or invite us into thinking about as it relates to relationship. So for me, it seemed like a natural place to start.
So when you begin to practice this out, right? Like this, which I'm right there with you, this relational God is all around us. And then we begin in 3 parts. As you begin to have conversations with people about that, is that a surprising thing that people see God as not theology, people see God as relational? And is there a disconnect between believing God is relational and practically living as though God is relational?
So you just asked like 3 questions. So
yeah. I'm just going to let it down there.
Of is there a disconnect? Yes, there's a disconnect between people saying or believing God is relational and then what that means in practice. I would say yes to that. Mm-hmm. I don't get pushback about people from people thinking about God as relational. Mm-hmm. The thing that I've gotten the most pushback about is that notion that I talk about in my book about God as lover, because that right there, people are like, no. Mm-hmm. And, in my mind, I'm like, well, God actually entered into humanity. That's pretty damn lover-like or lover-ish and intimate. Yeah. And we only associate lover with the act of sex in a particular heteronormative cishet understanding, which I think is one way to think about it, but it's not the only way. So people talk about God as a relational God, right? And I talk about how the first and second commandments is Jesus expounds on them in the New Testament around the first is to love God holistically. The second is to love neighbor as self. I think people get that we are supposed to be in relationship, but the way that we define that relationship, right, has either been God as parent, as it relates to being in relationship with God, or Jesus as my friend, but it's never really been this notion, which I bring up, of God as lover. And we tend not to go all the way to thinking about the relationship we have with ourselves, when in the second commandment, it is to love your neighbor as you love yourself. And I don't know how to love something as myself unless I love myself. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So people don't push back against the relational God, but I think going back to the latter part of your question around, is there a disconnect between how we understand something intellectually and how we embody it? Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. We did a series about self-love, expressing self-love, and really the core of it was caring for yourself. And you've written that revolutionary relationships, they can't happen separate and apart from loving yourself. When we did our series about self-love, we got quite a bit of pushback about people saying that we were being selfish or encouraging people to be selfish. How do you respond to folks who may have that same pushback against you, that we can't be lovers of ourselves without being selfish?
Well, I think that we have to help people dismantle that. I can't talk about self-love separate and apart from my identity as a Black Puerto Rican woman, right? When I think about self-love, I immediately think about Audre Lorde's definition, right? This Black feminist who said that I've come to understand that caring for myself is not self-indulgent. It is actually an act of political warfare. Now, she was writing this as someone who was on a part of a marginal group of people, a marginalized group of people, right? Black women, queer people that identified as queer. And so this notion that to actually look at self and say that I am loved, that I with my Black skin am beautiful, that I with this, non-heteronormative identity actually is worthy of love and care. And that in itself was a political act. And when I think about political, I think about an act that pushes up against, right, the norms and behaviors in society. So a part of my understanding of self-love departs from that. It's not just about me getting manicures and pedicures or having my glass of wine or doing spa days, which I love, but that's just more of the care on the superficial level. Mm-hmm. When I think about self-love, I think about being in touch with the fact that God actually found us worthy enough, right, to not only create us, but to constantly be in this redemption enterprise. And so if God thinks that highly of us as creation, then there should be something about myself that I love and love deeply and fiercely, because to not do so is to act like God made a mistake or to disregard the beauty that God has imprinted within creation. And so for me, that's what I think about when I think about self-love and self-care. And I really believe that there's probably 3 great things that are really weighing down and separating our humanity today. I think one is fear. I think one is the lie of scarcity. And I think one is a deep self-loathing. And I think that we act like we love ourselves when we don't even really like ourselves most of the time. And again, if I loved my neighbor as I loved myself, I think you would see certain things come out. What I feel like I see in the world today, whether it's in our dialogue, whether it's in our relationships or lack thereof, whether it's in our lack of curiosity about the other, is the fact that we don't love our neighbors as ourselves because we're not really loving ourselves. And so what we see is like this self-loathing that I really do believe is within ourselves that we have to deal with. And I think to deal with that is to actually come back to who God has first and foremost created us to be, which is redeemed, which is holy. I'm Lutheran, of the Lutheran persuasion. So like I can say I'm simultaneously saint and sinner, right? And there's two aspects that live in tension together. And so, yeah, I don't think self-loving or self-love and self-care is selfish. I think it's actually quite holy and sacred work that we have for so long ignored. And now I think we're reckoning with that ignorance.
So it gets back to, I mean, thinking through all of that, which is very deep, beautiful and deep. You go back to Genesis, it says God created male and female in God's image. That means at the core of who we are is the image of God, the Imago Dei. And so instead of trying to imprint or input something into us, life is really about getting something out of us, getting what was at the center from the very beginning out on top of us. And so we put Instagram filters on everything to try to masterpiece everything. But actually to get to the masterpiece is to pull everything back. And to be, I love that.
To go back to the beginning of our story.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and of the stories that most of us are a character in, and to remember and to be reminded of who God has created us to be, right? And of what God desperately desires for her creation. And I believe that's relationship. I believe that's love that is practiced through justice. And I believe that it's embodying what we see in the Trinity, right? A God that is liberative and creative and that is sustaining.
And it's funny, you don't get, at least I don't hear a lot of pushback from outside of the church world or the spiritual, Christianity, spiritual realm, when you say, hey, you need to work on yourself. This idea of like, if you're in the corporate world, hey, this leadership conference would be great for you to go to, or for you to go learn this, things to make yourself better. But when we start around talking about God, or we talk about Jesus, or, talk about the Holy Spirit, taking self-care, then you're right. It is that we get a lot of pushback of, well, that's selfish. Like, you're supposed to be serving others. Well, I want to serve others, but to serve others and to love others, I have to do that for myself.
Absolutely. Because then we almost become hypocritical.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? We're doing things to others that we don't deem ourselves worthy of.
Yeah.
So it leads me to more questions about how we do view self.
Have you thought through some ways of beginning to put aside some of that self-loathing? So somebody who may be guilty of that might be listening at this time, right? Like, what might be a step that they can undertake? Not even names.
I raise my hand.
That they could begin to see that image of God within themselves.
So I think, first of all, it becomes the awareness, right? What are the things that we say or think or feel about ourselves that most of us would probably never say, think, or feel about someone else? Right? I find sometimes that the things that I say to myself, I would never say to a friend.
Oh, yeah.
I would never, like someone that I'm walking alongside, accompanying, in relationship with, I can beat myself up like nobody's business, right? So no, if you are experiencing self-loathing, you're definitely not alone. So part of it is coming into awareness about what are the things you say, and then what are the things that you're taking in that might trigger you to say or feel or think those things. Right? I think we are in this time. So I'm 38 and I, am part of the exennial, kind of that cusp of generations where we didn't have internet, we didn't have all these things, and then all of a sudden we had it. And so I remember life before social media. And I can tell you now, as someone who was on social media, even in my own experience, that there are things and images that I see and that impact the way that I think about myself and feel about myself that lead me back to self-loathing. And so part of it is I have to be very careful also about what it is I'm consuming. And this is where the self-love thing comes in, because again, it's not just about the mental and the emotional, but it's also about the physical and the spiritual. what are the things that you're consuming that breed life within you? Or what are the things that are consuming that deal death to you, right? Death of spirit, death of your emotions. And I think we all have to reckon with that in our own lives. And then I'm figuring out in my current state in life how to deal with two things and how to actually engage these practices regularly. So one is, what does it look like to be content? So I don't know if you or any of your followers are Enneagram people, but I am a strong 7. And I'm never content. Like, I'm always looking for what's next. Or if I do something well, it's like, okay, that was that. Now it's on to the next thing and all the other things we can do. And so what does it mean to be content in this present time and space with myself, right? And it's this like paradox, right? Like, self-love, the act of self-love does require work and practice. And a lot of the practice is about being, like being okay with who you are, being in relationship with yourself. And so the contentment is one side of it, and then gratitude is another side of it, right? How do we practice gratitude in a place and space or in a culture that like doesn't really spend much time being grateful? Like, we always want more. It's never enough. We're never good enough. You know, I mean, we have this holiday Thanksgiving, which that's a whole other episode and conversation. But like, outside of that, when do you talk about people? And maybe in churches, there is a bit of that conversation, but when do people really talk about living a grateful life, right? So I think about all of those things. And then the last thing I'll say about that is I'm really curious about dismantling the tapes that play, right? And the narratives that we tell ourselves, about our upbringing, about our family. And I think that a lot of times the self-loathing, right, is deeply connected to the stories of our lives. And so we have to start to dismantle and deconstruct those stories and look at the pieces that have led us to not like ourselves, to actually look at ourselves with disgust, to, you know, struggle with aspects of ourselves. Because a lot of that, it started somewhere, right? If we go back to the creation story and we believe that God created us in God's image and said it was good, then there are things in our story that came in to then tell us that we're not good, that we're not worthy, that we're not enough, that we're not holy. And I feel like all of that is a lie. And I think our theology has been a culprit in that. Our religions have been a culprit in that, you know, and so it requires kind of a all hands on deck dismantling to start to put together and actively engage this work of self-love.
There was something that caught me within the book, a line that you had written about the middle of the book that it struck me because in this similar kind of way, it turns around some of the traditional ways that we think about our theology. That so often we think about the second person of the Trinity, about Jesus coming to earth as this atonement, which means coming to earth in a sense to die. There are even songs about it. I can't name the song off my top of my head, but you know, we sing songs about born to die. You wrote that what if we believed that God came to live and not to die? What was the significance of that question?
So that also departs from my identity. And so womanist theological thought, or womanism, is an aspect of theology, a way of thinking theologically about God that departs from a Black woman's lived experience, specifically hearkening back to the story of Hagar and her son Ishmael. But this notion that I encountered when I was actually in seminary, so this was over 10 years ago, that so much of our atonement, right, the ways in which God brings humanity back to God's self, and so much of our talk about redemption and suffering, it can become problematic because a lot of times we substitute ourselves out, right, in these stories. And even though we don't like to tell you this, a lot of times people read scripture and they think that they're Jesus in scripture. They don't think that they're the people. Like, I think about the road to Emmaus. If that's used in mission or missiology courses, people think that they're Jesus on the road. And I'm like, nah, you the people that don't know what's happening, right? Like, we're never Jesus in the story, but we always think we are.
Yeah.
And so even with Jesus and the dying, right, and the cross, right, which is kind of the singular redemptive act in Christianity, which a lot of people start there, that a lot of times has been transmuted to then say, well, if Christ suffered like this, then my suffering must be like that, right? And then that all suffering is redemptive. Now, I believe that God redeems all suffering, but I don't believe that all suffering is necessary to be redeemed. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So because historically our tradition has talked about the suffering of Christ as the thing that atones for the depraved human condition, it makes room for the ongoing suffering that people perpetrate against each other, that humanity perpetrates, right?
Yeah.
And so in seminary, I was introduced to Dolores Williams, kind of the mother of historic womanist theological thought. And we had to read her book, Sisters in the Wilderness. And that started to blow my mind because it started to make me ask questions about that framework. And here's the thing, everything is questioned. You can question everything. A lot of the things we believe now actually come from traditions of, a lot of times, white males, right, making decisions about the intent of Scripture. So even in thinking about theories of atonement, that wasn't something that necessarily came straight out the Bible. That was something, there are multiple theories of atonement that came up as people were having councils and trying to figure out how to organize this new religious thought, which I value and I respect. And yet, like, if they could do it, we can do it to a certain extent, right? Like, there is this idea that we can also think about and wonder and question. And so as I was reading Dolores Williams, as I was kind of digging in and diving into womanist theology, it became for me a question of, so what would this look like if we believed that Christ came to live, right? If that was the atoning moment, Jesus being born in human flesh, right? Because up until that point, God had just been divine. And now we're talking about a God that's choosing to be in relationship with God's creation in a way that before had not happened. And in that God choosing to, like, what if God chose to live, or the atoning thing was the life of Christ? Then we start to see a lot more about how to do life together. We start to see a lot more about relationship. We start to see a lot more about being on the journey, being people of the way, right? I think when we run to the cross, which the cross is absolutely something that I believe in, something that is like true for me. Like, I believe that God died on the cross and that God died in the form of Jesus and that God rose again. I believe that. And I believe that there were powers and principalities at play that led to that death. I believe that there were other things happening. And I believe that if we only look at the death of Christ on the cross, we don't pay attention to the markers of what it means to be followers of Jesus and what it means to be in relationship. Because if we just run to the cross, we're missing out the whole 33 years or the information that shows us about who we are as children of God, who we are as disciples or followers of Christ, who we are in relationship to the marginalized and the oppressed, who we are as people that speak against powers and principalities. So running to the cross sometimes like makes us ignore the other parts. And for me, that's problematic.
I'm just thinking through the aspect of, does looking at his life first, Jesus' life first, does the cross, I'm trying to think how to put this into play. To me, the way I've always looked at it is the way he lived his life mattered and was the example and taught us how to do life together because of the cross. Does that make sense? So because there were a lot of people back in the day, there's still people today that claim to be a Messiah, claim to be God, claim to be those things. Yet I'm with you. I believe the cross happened. I believe the death happened. And I think a lot of times we stop at the death and we don't talk about the resurrection. You know, like the death doesn't matter unless the resurrection comes.
Absolutely.
If death happens, there's no empty grave. There's no nothing. And so because that happened, now I go, okay, how did this guy live? How did this, and I'm with you. I think the disconnect is really strong. People want to talk about the fact that a lot of church wings, you'll go really heavy justice and no gospel. Right. Or the other side of the coin is you'll go really heavy gospel and no justice. And it's like, no, they're both and. They go together. You can't have one without the other. And they bring beauty to both of them. But I'm just talking this out. Like, this is podcast, what we do. Like, I've never started with his life to then look at the cross. But I've always started at the cross. And then that makes me look at his life and take that seriously.
Yeah. That's what stopped me. It's a paradigm shifter.
Yeah.
I guess I just keep falling back into like 1990s worship music, and like another song that pops to my head is a song Basic Instructions Before Leaving Earth. Like a lot of times
I don't know that song.
You don't know that? Oh, you got to look it up.
That's an interesting title.
Basic Instructions Before Leaving Earth. That's the name of the song, though. Basic Instructions.
Oh.
It's got a
There's
little
got to
bit
be
of
there's
like
got to be hand motions to this.
None that I know of, but
yeah. Whoever wrote that song, put hand
it's a
motions
song that
to
we
it.
sang back in the day. I'm gonna make it available in the show notes just so people have access to this thing. But a lot of times that is how we treat our religion, right? Like it is this way of kind of getting through life until we can kind of leave this whole kind of corrupted mess of creation behind. But shifting the idea that like atonement, the big deal happens when God enters into a human existence instead of when God is killed to exit out of it. It changes what we think about life, that it isn't about, getting our basic instructions before leaving Earth. It is about creating that godlike presence in the here and now. And boy, there's a lot of urgency to that, isn't there?
I mean, and that's the thing. So even that notion of like basic instructions before leaving Earth, it's kind of like, why are we leaving? Like, I mean, I know that death is inevitable. Death is a part of life, right? Mm-hmm. And I also believe death doesn't have the final say. Mm-hmm. But when I say the Lord's Prayer, like there is an urgency about working towards the revelation of God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven today, right? So I think, and this is interesting. This might be a rabbit hole, but I'm going to go down it. Like, I think there is something to be said about this thinking that we need to leave behind this thing that is supposedly broken. I mean, that's a bit of a privileged stance to take, right? And I'm thinking about this, like at the same time, I'm looking at and reading about the 1619 Project, right? That the New York Times Magazine put out about slavery. So we're commemorating, recognizing the 400 years, not celebrating, but recognizing the 400 years since the first slaves, right, landed on the shores in 1619. And I was listening to that podcast, and one of the things that the creator is leading us through is the reality of how Black Americans like myself, people that are descendant of slaves, like built this country, like things that we know intellectually, but we don't always think through, and that this is our home, right? Because there is not a place for me to go back to. Like I have no place to go back to. This is where my family has been for generations. And so this notion that I'm just going to leave it because it's not as good as I want it to be, right? Which a lot of people think, especially in the times that we're now, we can just leave the US and go on to something else. The reality is that this is what we've got. So what does it mean to engage in a struggle for justice, for love, for peace here in this moment, and not be so focused on an exit strategy? Because to exit is to be kind of privileged, to say, well, I'm just going to focus on the afterlife, which to me is like, well, God already dealt with that. Like, I can't spend too much time focused on what happens after I die, because A, I really don't know. B, I mean, I really don't know. And like, all I know is this present moment and this present time and the relationships in front of me, or the lack of relationships in front of me. And so I don't believe that our call is to be, like someone used to say, don't be so heavenly bound that you're no earthly good. I think that we're called to be present because God chose to be present with us. I think that if there was nothing to be redeemed or nothing good about creation, A, God wouldn't have created it, and B, God wouldn't have chose to send Jesus.
In the world of, we're listening to this on a podcast, right? Like we're having this conversation here. You're on a screen, we're looking at you, et cetera. People are going to hear this driving in their car and on their evening run and taking their kids to school. There's, on way to class, all these different places through technology. We love technology. It's incredible. How does that play? And that's our culture, right? We're all about following people, right? We're all about following people from a distance, right? And that's how we see people, right? Get notifications when your mom posts on Instagram, and you also get a notification when ESPN posts on it. It's like this whole notion of following. You're talking about relationships, which is different than following. Talk about that in the sense of getting back around the table, eating together, doing life together. Yeah, let's use technology, but let's come back to the table in relationships. Talk a little bit about that.
So I'm someone that believes that relationships can happen in a variety of ways. And
For
I
sure.
say that as someone who deals with or lives with depression, right, and anxiety. And there was a time in my life when the people that I was closest to, I'm using air quotes because you all can't see me, but the people I was closest to were people that I didn't know in a face-to-face way, right? But I was a part of mental health support groups. There are a couple of women in particular that I literally fell in love with from afar, from the standpoint of just, they were a part of bringing me back to life, right? And our relationship then eventually moved to in person.
Yeah.
And so we've been friends now for 10 years. And it started off as a Twitter connection to Facebook chat group to texting to now we're actually in real life friends. I think that there is something about embodiment as someone who begins kind of with the incarnation that is fundamental to relationships. So while relationships can happen in a variety of ways, at some point to have an embodied experience kind of brings it full circle. And we were made in our bodies, right? We were not saved from our bodies. We were saved in the human body. It's not like God came and like there was like this alien intervention and then all of our spirits kind of ascended and then the bodies were left here to just be without a spirit. Like God came in the human form. Yeah. And so I believe the body matters. And I believe that the imagery of sitting around a table, of eating, of sharing the ups and downs of life, right? Mimic that. It shows the importance of the face-to-face. And I think that one of the reasons that we don't have the discourse that we have right now on social media, I mean, we go to that. I don't blame social media for doing anything than exploiting like our inherent nature.
Yeah, for sure.
That we don't always fight against, and it just makes it easier.
For sure.
But I've kind of made the point that I will never say something that's on social media to someone that I wouldn't say to them to their face. Now, for me, it's not that much of a line because I'm pretty honest and but when you have those feelings or that, things think in your head, I'm not going to say something that I wouldn't say to someone in person online because I do consider it a relationship. Yeah. But a lot of times it's not considered relational. It's considered transactional, or it's considered that my role in this kind of conversation we're having is to be judge, jury, and like all of the things, right? To call people out, to tell people about themselves. And it's like, that's not a relationship. That's not a relationship you'd have in real life. So why would you do that online? And so I think that we do have to get back, or we do have to move whatever it is we are doing electronically and in the virtual world into a space that happens in an interactive way in our bodies. And there's also something, I mean, I just love the human body. Like there are things that I can sense by being in a space with someone, right? Whether it's energetic, we don't just communicate with our words. So like, we don't always get the facial tones or the body language or the eyes. Like, I think we're only getting a part of the story when we're not enfleshed. Yeah. And I think that's what's so beautiful about the Christian story. I feel like we got a fuller picture because God became embodied. God took on flesh. Yeah, that's beautiful. And then the breath of life that moves through us is a reminder that we are indeed a part of the Creator.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Well, you recognize the soul as being part of our whole being, and therefore our souls are in need of tending. How do you practice soul care these days? What are you doing to tend your soul?
Look, I have to be honest.
This
year has been so hard. Like 2019, I'm ready for it to just go. Like the amount of death, and I'm a new business owner, and so first year of being on my own, which has been great. Like I know that what I do can actually make me a living, but it doesn't look like a paycheck every other week type of thing, so there's that. There's some family stuff going on, my own health stuff. So I feel like soul care can be the first thing to go. And that question that you all ask is a question that I ask myself all the time. How is it with your soul? Yeah. Right. And what are the things that I'm doing or not doing that grounds my soul? And that, again, reminds me to whom I belong and what purposes that I'm here for. So soul care in this season has been a struggle. Soul care in other seasons has looked like spiritual direction, has looked like meditation, has looked like my relationships, which I call my soul sisters. And that still is a thing in this season. So I can't actually say that that's not happening. I'm just so blessed to have so many female friends. I don't know what it is. Like, that's just, I love women. And I mean, I say that platonically. Like, I love the women I'm in relationship with, diverse women from various walks of life, that we have similar values. We have a love of God, and that's broadly defined with some folks. But we are rooting for each other. We hold each other accountable. We practice forgiveness. And that fills my soul like few other things can. Like, and I'm reminded of who I am through the relationships I have with them, and of what I can be, right? And of what I can do and show up in this world in a way that's reflective of the gifts that God has given me. Because I think one of the things I'm realizing when I'm not in relationship or I'm not listening to my soul, I get further and further disconnected from that who God has called me to be, right? And what I'm called to do. So I do believe there's seasons in our life though, right? There's seasons that I feel like I'm more physically minded. There's seasons that I feel like I'm more emotionally minded, though that tends to be a constant in my life because of my depression. I have to be kind of on top of that. But the soul work is interesting. And I would say this, because of my deep work around reflection in general, I know that the season I'm in, that there are gifts in this place, right? Like, whether I describe it as darkness or fog or trying to figure out like what's the next direction, I think the beauty is that when my soul is yearning for more, I tend to find myself be more still and listen in ways that I'm not always attentive to when everything is seemingly going well.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I am now. And I'll accept all the prayers or whatever y'all got.
Yeah. What would you say to the person listening that goes, man, I would love to have that group. I got a lot of people around me, got a lot of acquaintances. I play ball on Tuesday nights. You know, I go with my girls out on the weekend, you know, but like that relationship was different. What are some steps that we can take to take the relationships that we do have and begin to form these deeper callings that you just described?
Well, the first thing people can do is get my book and read it with someone else.
That will be in the show notes too.
Yeah, there's a study guide. There's a study guide with it that I think would help facilitate some of those conversations for sure, right? But I think it's about asking for what you need. And I think it's also the recognition that if you need it, someone else needs it. Like, I think that a lot of times we're like, well, no one else is feeling like that. And I'm like, nah, 10 out of 10 times, there is someone else in your life that is feeling.
I don't think the teachers used to say, like, don't be afraid to ask the question because you got it, somebody else got it too. Yeah. You know?
Sure. And that proves itself true all the time.
100%.
And so I always tell people to start small. So like, I do have one of my dear friends, and she is based in the UK. She lives in Birmingham, England. She's one of my prayer partners. So we commit to talking, like actual video chatting once a week, where we talk about how things are going, where we pray together, where we look at what we want to accomplish that next week. And that's a core part of our relationship. So I think sometimes it just begins with starting small and asking someone. And I think people feel like that risk is too much. And yet, if someone were to ask you for that, you would probably say yes, especially someone that you care about or that you are wanting a deeper relationship with. So I think asking for what you need. And if you don't know what you need, just asking for someone to accompany you for a period of time and saying, look, can we just check in? And then I would say that vulnerability always begets vulnerability. So the more vulnerable you're willing to be, so vulnerability is different than emotional manipulation and vomiting on someone, like all of your stuff, right? Vulnerability is saying, you know what, I need help doing this life. Like, life is hard to do alone, and we have similar values, and we might have similar struggles, and I'd love to talk to you about that, right? Yeah. That's a very different thing. And then going where those conversations lead.
Yeah. Which Brene Brown says you can't be vulnerable without courage.
No,
you know,
you can't.
It takes courage to be vulnerable, and to which is incredible. Yeah, I think there was that TV show. I think it's still out. I mean, maybe hasn't started back its new season. I think it's like A Million Little Things or whatever. It was like the new Parenthood kind of or whatever. Like, yeah,
it was like the group of diverse friends or something.
Yeah, diverse friends, and basically, this isn't a spoiler alert. This is in the trailer. You know, the episode starts with these four best friends and they're guys, and then their families become all best friends, and one of the guys commits suicide. And they're at the bar that night getting ready to go to the game without him because they always went to the game together. And one guy was like, how did we miss this? How did we? And he goes, we don't talk. We go to the game together. We cook out together. We barbecue together. But when's the last time we talked to each other? And it's just this wake up call to go, man, we have people in our lives. And I love that is what you're saying. We have people in our lives that are those people. So for us to go like, I don't have that person. No, you got that person. You do. 90% of us have that person to some degree. Yeah. Maybe not all of us, but 90% of us have that person. We just have to be vulnerable and courageous enough to go like, hey, I need you. I need you in this role, and I need our friendship to go here.
And that's where I think that social media can help sometimes,
for sure,
right? Because
for sure.
they're groups.
Yep.
Sometimes it's easier to do that anonymously or to do that with folks that you don't know personally. Mm-hmm. And I'm all for that, right? Like if there is a safe space, a space that, curates again, opportunities for people to share life together in ways that lead to health and wholeness and healing, then, you can Google anything now to find a support group or something for that. And the other thing two things I would say. So I love Brene Brown, and I love the conversation of, to be courageous is to show up with your whole heart, which is not something we think about when we think about being courageous. We think about brave and bold and like strong, and all of our emotions are like hidden away and locked away. And she's like, no, you lead with your heart. You lead with your emotional center, right? Yeah. And that's very different. The other thing I would say is that men, y'all, I feel bad for y'all because y'all aren't taught how to do this, right? Like I think with women, and I'm sorry or I apologize for using such a stark generalization of men and women are binary, but with women, like we at least have spaces that curate conversations. We know how to talk to each other. Like we've been doing it since we were young. Like our sleepovers were talking sleepovers. Y'all's were video games or whatever else activities you did. But we talked, right? And even if you didn't talk to your parents or adults in your life, you would talk to your girls. I think for men, it's a very different and can be awkward like terrain to traverse. And so for the men out there that are interested in that and have the space to do it, like I say, please take the first step. And I'm thinking about my brother he's 32. And this year he asked me to help him find a mentor. And it's been incredible. And it's been a struggle for him. He's like, I don't talk to dudes like this. Yeah. Like the things, and it's like, but I see the difference it makes for him to have a guy who is from a similar walk of life, right? Engage with him in a way that is life-giving, that is affirming, that he can hold him accountable. And I do that, but I think that sometimes men need to do that with each other. And I sometimes feel bad for y'all because it's much harder. And our society says for you to be vulnerable is a sign of weakness, when I just think it's the ultimate strength.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rosella, for folks who want to kind of continue the conversation with you, or at least follow you, if not friend you, where can they find you online?
I am on Instagram and Twitter, the same handle at Rozella HW. And I'm on Facebook at Rozella H. White. It's Rozella Haydee White, the Love Big Coach. I'd love to connect with people. I am a spiritual life coach, and I do work not only with spiritual life and leadership coaching, but I'm also working with specifically white folks that want to do some dismantling and deconstruction around racism. And I really love that work. I love coaching. I love accompanying folks. And so, I would love to connect with you on social media or via my website, which is rosellahwhite.com.
And thank you, friend, for joining us on this episode. I hope it's been as inspirational and as fun for you as it has been for us in doing this interview. Also want to thank the team at United Methodist Communications who helps put this whole thing together. If you're interested in finding out more about the Compass Podcast or some of the side projects that we have going alongside it, you can look at www.rethinkchurch.org and see a lot of cool resources. Another thing you can do to help us out in a big way is to hop on over to your podcast platform of choice, leave a rating and review. That's really the best way to help spread the word about what we're doing with the Compass Podcast. We'll be back again soon with another episode. In the meantime, be well.